Welcome everyone to another Zoom-based event hosted by the University of Michigan Club of Washington, D.C. And welcome to whoever is not local and can log on because of Zoom technology. Our honored guest tonight is Sara Fitzgerald. Once upon a time, there were only men who edited the Michigan Daily, but Sara broke the mold. She was the first woman editor of the Michigan Daily. She went on to a distinguished career at, among other places, the Washington Post. And when she left the day-to-day grind of newspapers and the digital world of those newspapers, I think Sara mentioned that she worked on the internet before there was an internet. I forgot the exact phrase. You can share that with us. She was involved with something called Digital Inc., which I remember because I'm a baby boomer myself. Sara's first book of note is a book about a great woman that many people in this audience may not remember, Elly Peterson. It's Elly Peterson, Mother of the Moderates. She actually is featured in the new miniseries about Phyllis Schlafly, who will not go down in history as one of the moderates. Those of you that can find a copy of the Elly Peterson book, please do so. I found it on Amazon. More recently, Sara has written a novel involving T.S. Eliot and the love of his life, The Poet's Girl, and coming out sometime this summer, and Sara will tell us when exactly, a University of Michigan Press publication, Conquering Heroines, How Women Fought Sex Bias at Michigan and Paved the Way for Title IX. Sara will share the screen and have a PowerPoint, after which there'll be an opportunity for questions. Please do not unmute yourself during the presentation and submit questions through the chat room, and I will faithfully recount them. I won't revise them or provide alternative fact versions, I trust. I promise you. Sara, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you, David. First, I'm going to see what I do to try to get my PowerPoint up here, which doesn't seem to be happening. There we go. Is that showing on your screen now?
We see you.
Okay. Oops.
The share screen feature should work, the green item.
Well, hang on a second.
You're accessing Zoom through the same laptop that this PowerPoint is on, correct?
Right.
Okay, well.
Okay, so I'm back. Is it the green?
Yeah, share screen in the middle. Click on that arrow.
There.
It works.
How about that? Okay, sorry about that, guys. Thank you, David, and thanks to the DC Alumni Club for sponsoring my talk today. I think over the past few months, we're all getting more accustomed to these virtual gatherings. Last week, the Michigan Daily alumni organized an online reunion, and some of my friends who were part of that are here tonight. This is the paper's 130th anniversary, and we had originally hoped to have a big event on a football weekend in the fall. But like so many of us, we had to change our plans. This is a photo of me when I was editor of the Daily in the fall of 1972. You can see how intense I looked back then. Over the past decade, as David mentioned, I've published 3 books, and 2 of them this year. When David and I talked about which of my books I might talk about, we decided I would tell you a little bit about all 3. One is a novel, one is a biography, and the newest one is a work of narrative nonfiction. They are all quite different, but they have one thing in common. They all tell the little-known stories of real-life women, and my interest in exploring these stories grew out of my time at Michigan, and in particular, my studies as a history major. I entered Michigan in the fall of 1969 and graduated in 1973. That was arguably the most tumultuous time in the university's history. One of my colleagues on the Daily was sports editor John Papanek, who went on to become managing editor of Sports Illustrated and the founding editor of ESPN magazine. In an anthology of essays about the Daily a few years ago, John did a good job of capturing the mood on campus when the two of us arrived. He wrote, "Thanks to so much of what our upperclassmates had done and gone through during the crucial run-up years of 66 to 68, September 1969 seemed, to us at least, to be the launch date for every kind of freedom imaginable: social, sexual, cultural, musical, academic, pharmaceutical, and nobody could tell us what we could not do, least of all the stuffy university administrators in the brand new brick fortress built to house and protect them from us, or the bureaucrats who thought they ran things from Lansing, and for that matter, Washington, D.C. From September through November 69, the university raged and seethed in an endless series of battles, running from cold to very, very hot, between students and administrators, students and landlords, students and other students, students and police, administrators and faculty, townies, and the university community," end quote. Robin Fleming was president of Michigan at the time, and in his memoir, he observed that Michigan students had agitated all throughout the university's history. But what made this period different, he said, was the unrest in the wider society. He wrote, "We were involved in an unpopular war in Vietnam. We were engaged in civil unrest over racial differences, and protesters had learned the advantages inherent in the tactics of civil disobedience. On top of that, our values were changing. There were severe strains on the traditional family structure. Drugs, particularly marijuana, had entered the scene. Premarital sex was no longer the taboo it had once been, and respect and civility were lacking." The 1969 fall semester began with a sit-in to achieve a student-run bookstore, followed by many anti-war protests and the Black Action Movement strike in March of 1970. My newest book details a story that began to unfold in the spring of 1970. We did a little play on the lyrics to Hail to the Victors by titling it Conquering Heroines. Let me set the stage by briefly recapping some of the history of women at U of M. The university, as most of you probably know, was founded in 1817, but women weren't admitted until 1870. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the admission of Madeline Stockwell, who is shown here. Throughout much of the university's history, its culture was more like that of an all-male Ivy League school than the land-grant colleges of the Big Ten that were founded later in the 19th century. I didn't know this at the time, but when I applied to Michigan in late 1968, the admissions committee was enforcing a quota of 55% men, 45% women for the freshman class. In 1970, they openly acknowledged in interviews that they imposed the quota when they realized that women were outperforming men in high school, and it appeared to violate their sense of what was right and normal if the freshman class had more women than men. When I entered Michigan, women were not permitted to join the marching band. Women professors were barred from the science club. There was a time when women could not enter the Michigan Union through the front door. The billiard room at the Union remained off limits to women until 1968. In 1970, the Daily discovered that the N Club of Ann Arbor was holding smokers before home football games, but was not inviting the women who were regents or university vice presidents or top sports editors of the Daily. Women on campus were starting to realize that while Michigan was awarding graduate degrees to women, it was hiring very few of them as professors. You could go through 4 years at Michigan without ever having a single female professor, particularly after the phys ed requirement was abolished in 1968. At the same time, professional women around the country were discovering that they had been excluded from the protections of the major civil rights laws of the 1960s. That was the price that had to be paid to move the legislation through Congress. One of those women was Bernice Sandler, who had earned a PhD from the University of Maryland, but was frustrated that its psychology department would not hire her at a time the department was expanding. When she tried to find out why, Bunny Sandler was told by a friendly colleague that she, quote, came on too strong for a woman. In researching her potential remedies, Sandler discovered that in 1967, President Johnson had issued an executive order that barred federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of sex. She realized that every major American university was a federal contractor, and that this could give her the leverage she needed to challenge sex discrimination. But she wasn't a lawyer, and she was not sure she had interpreted the executive order correctly. So she phoned the Labor Department's Office of Federal Contract Compliance. She was lucky that her call ended up with a high-ranking civil servant named Vincent Macaluso. Macaluso told her he had been waiting for someone to call and secretly guided Sandler on how to file a complaint. In March of 1970, she filed the first one against the University of Maryland in the name of an organization called the Women's Equity Action League. It viewed itself as more moderate than the National Organization for Women and was made up of professional women like Sandler who were concerned mostly about job discrimination. Sandler began publicizing her approach and encouraging women to contact her for help in filing complaints against other universities. One of them was an Ann Arbor attorney named Jean King. She had spent all of her adult life in Ann Arbor, first as a student and then as a university employee. In 1968, when she was 44, she was one of a handful of women to graduate from the Michigan Law School. She was active in the Democratic Party and had just organized a group of local women to oppose the nomination of G. Harold Carswell to the US Supreme Court because of the position he had taken in a major sex discrimination case. King brought together a small group of women who researched and drafted a complaint against the university. It was filed in May 1970 and co-signed by Mary Yord, the widow of a law school administrator who was active in the Republican Party and involved in women's issues. The complaint noted that of 900 persons at the professorial rank in LS&A at the time, only 34 were women. Across the university, only 6.6% of professors were women. And if you excluded the School of Nursing, that number dropped to 5.3%. Even in other disciplines like education that had traditionally attracted many women students, only 6 of the 100 professors in that school were women at the time. But the complaint went beyond the classroom. Michigan actually employed more women than men in non-teaching roles, but they were relegated to the lowest paying jobs. Many of these women also complained that they were expected to do the work of managers and business professionals, but were not being compensated for it. Among the dozens of complaints that Sandler helped organize that year, the Michigan one turned out to be the one that the US Department of Health, Education, and Welfare investigated most aggressively. Why did that happen? Partly it was because King was a savvy political strategist who made skillful use of the media and members of Congress to bring pressure to bear on the federal bureaucracy and the university. King and Yord were also outsiders, so the university could not retaliate against them the way many universities retaliated against women faculty members who brought similar complaints on their campuses. Another factor was that Michigan was regarded as the leading public research university and was also one of the top federal contractors. There was some thought that if the government could get Michigan to comply, it would be easier to get other universities to fall into line. Finally, there's some evidence that U of M administrators wanted to take the lead in challenging HEW because they feared other colleges might make concessions that they did not want to make. In the end, Michigan became the first university where contracts were actually withheld because of sex discrimination, and its subsequent settlement became the template used in negotiation with other colleges. For several years, the federal government had been monitoring the university's record on racial discrimination. In August 1970, a few months after King and Yord's complaint was filed, 2 teams of investigators came to campus to review the university's record on sex discrimination. Here's a photo taken by the university's PR department from the first visit, showing Alan Smith, Vice President for Academic Affairs, Robin Fleming, and on the right, William Cash, who was then the highest ranking Black administrator when he was serving as Fleming's human relations assistant. They are posed with Clifford Minton, who led the first HEW investigative team. There was a certain amount of tension at that time about the difference between discrimination against minorities and discrimination against women. King later said that if the BAM strike had not occurred, she would not have filed her complaint because she didn't want the university to pit the 2 groups against each other. After the first investigated team visited, King complained to members of Congress and HEW officials higher up that Minton had not understood the nature of sex discrimination at universities because most of his work had been focused on dealing with racial discrimination in the manufacturing and construction industries. A few weeks later, HEW sent a second team led by a new investigator. 2 months later, in October 1970, HEW told the university that its team had found wide-ranging instances of sex discrimination. Among other things, it found that the admission of women to doctoral programs lagged behind the numbers who had earned master's degrees, and the number of women who were hired as faculty lagged behind the number who had earned doctorates. It also found many instances in which the university's anti-nepotism rules had served to discriminate against women whose husbands were faculty members. HEW told President Fleming that if the university did not respond appropriately within 30 days and amend its existing affirmative action plan for minorities, then HEW would begin withholding federal contracts. A month later, HEW made good on its threat. King and her supporters were thrilled that HEW had gotten tough on the university, but they were disappointed that the first contract to be withheld was one that was to provide family planning consulting services to the government of Nepal. One interesting coincidence of the calendar was that HEW's findings were delivered just as the university was preparing to celebrate the centennial of the admission of women to Michigan. A teach-in that week helped campus women organize around their shared concerns, but it also highlighted divisions over the best strategies to pursue. The closing event at Hill Auditorium featured a panel discussion with some of the country's leading feminists. As the event got underway, the more radical women who were present took over the stage, asserting that there was no need for a panel of experts because every woman was an expert on her own oppression. Eventually, things were calmed down and the discussion proceeded in a less structured way. I was a very junior reporter on the Daily when I was first assigned to cover the story, and it continued to unfold over my time at Michigan and for several years after I graduated. The legislation that became known as Title IX finally passed in the summer of 1972, but it was a few years before the law and its regulations took effect and its full impact on education and college athletics was understood. And over the subsequent years, federal enforcement efforts waxed and waned as the priorities of presidential administrations changed. As I look back, I realize that my years at Michigan were a very empowering time for women. It was during those years that Ms. Magazine and the National Women's Political Caucus were founded, and when the Supreme Court issued its decision in Roe v. Wade. I was inspired by women like Jean King and Kitty Sklar, who served as my history thesis advisor. Kitty was among the professors who pushed to organize the Women's Studies Department at that time. This photo shows Kitty seated at the center with other LS&A professors who helped to start the department. They are from left Elizabeth Duvan, Margaret Lurie behind the lectern, Lois Hoffman, and Norma Diamond. It's worth noting that Duvan and King were friends, and behind the scenes, the psychology professor quietly provided statistical and research help to King when the HEW complaint was drafted. The research interests of these women helped to shape the perspective of students like me as we pursued our own academic work. As 2020 approached, I knew it would be the 50th anniversary of the filing of the HEW complaint. I felt this chapter of the university's history had never been fully explored. I discovered that the Bentley Historical Library held oral histories of many women professors who had lived through these changes. I learned about other women faculty members who were so frustrated with the sex discrimination they encountered at Michigan that they left the university and became academic superstars elsewhere. The papers of Robin Fleming and other university administrators are now available in the archive, and I could confirm how Fleming had enlisted the help of other university presidents to lobby top HEW officials to relax the sanctions. Those officials included Eliot Richardson, who was secretary of HEW at the time. Richardson's papers are now housed at the Library of Congress. I was delighted to discover that those records included his appointment books and transcripts of telephone calls with people like Harvard President Nathan Pusey and Marvin Esch, the congressman who then represented Ann Arbor. Another key official was J. Stanley Pottinger, who headed HEW's Office of Civil Rights before moving over to the Justice Department. Pottinger's papers are in the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor. As he began reaching out to women leaders at the time, Pottinger actually became romantically involved with Gloria Steinem. He turned up in the news again recently when his law firm represented women who said they were victims of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking. I was also able to connect with several women faculty members who had been on campus in the 1970s. I was particularly grateful to arrange a face-to-face interview with Barbara Newell as she was about to turn 90. Newell was the highest ranking woman administrator at Michigan at the time. She was also the first chair of the university's Commission on Women, which was created in response to the HEW investigation, and is shown meeting here. To Newell's left in this photo is Harriet Mills, a faculty member in the Chinese department, who said she was radicalized by what she learned about discrimination on campus through her service on the commission. After Newell left Michigan in 1971, she went on to serve as president of Wellesley College and later chancellor of the Florida State University system. Over the past 50 years, Michigan has developed a reputation as a strong proponent of diversity and affirmative action strategies, but it wasn't always so. And I think much of this earlier history will shock and disturb many of today's readers when they learn more about it. One of the members of HEW's investigative team was a young lawyer named Esther Lardent. She went on to teach at the Georgetown University Law School and founded the Pro Bono Institute. A few years ago, women in the American Bar Association set out to capture the memories of pioneers like Lardent. In interviews about a decade ago, she recalled that she was, quote, appalled by what she and her fellow investigators had found at Michigan. She said, I don't think any of us sort of realized how intense this was, how accepted it was, how widespread it was. Women were clearly not taken seriously. They were not viewed as peers. What we would do is literally go through people's credentials, and the credentials would be identical to a man, and they would be seen as second rate or innately presenting problems and obstacles and that sort of thing. It was exciting because this had never been done before. We literally created the model for how the review went. Women were there in greater numbers, and women were applying in greater numbers, and it was just a different kind of discrimination, but it had an intensity to it that was very strong. When I thought about doing civil rights work, I had always thought about it in terms of race. We have such a horrible history that is pernicious and lingering to this very day, obviously, racism in this country. But there was a kind of viciousness about this sex discrimination that was really disturbing. I'm grateful that my editors at University of Michigan Press have been very supportive of my book, and despite the challenges we all faced with the pandemic shutdown, they have kept the publication schedule on track. They've now got a pre-order site posted on their website, and it should be released officially later this summer. So look for it there, and I hope you might enjoy reading it. I also want to share with all of you that the issues of the Michigan Daily through 2014 have all been digitized and can be searched online on the website of the Bentley Library. This was a great help to me as I did my research, and should be fun for many of you to check out as well. As I mentioned at the outset, the books I've written were inspired by my days as a history major at Michigan. I wrote my senior thesis on the flapper phenomenon, and I enjoyed revisiting the 1920s when I wrote my novel, The Poet's Girl, which was published at the start of this year. The poet in question is T.S. Eliot, and the girl of the title is the American woman who was his first love, a college professor and amateur actress named Emily Hale. So what led me to write this story? Well, for a number of years, I've been part of a small women's group that meets monthly to discuss a topic of the hostess's choosing. About 5 years ago, our hostess said she loved a particular Eliot poem when she was in college, and she wanted us to discuss it. The poem was Burnt Norton, the first of the Eliot poems that became known as the Four Quartets. I had studied the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in high school, but the last literature course I had taken was when I took 2 semesters of great books freshman year. And I think the only English literature on the syllabus of that course was James Joyce's Ulysses. So I Googled Burnt Norton to find the poem online, and that led me to its Wikipedia entry. It explained that Burnt Norton was an abandoned manor that Eliot and Hale had visited in the 1930s. The next sentence piqued my curiosity. Even though Eliot was married, he spent a lot of time with Hale and might possibly have become involved with her had he not been married. Even after their time at Burnt Norton, Eliot stayed in close correspondence with her and sent her many of his poems. Now, I didn't know much about Eliot's poetry, but I did know that he had been married twice. So who was this Emily Hale, and how did she fit in between his two marriages? I started to explore that question. I quickly learned that over the course of their lifetimes, Eliot had written Hale more than 1,100 letters. In 1956, Hale had donated them to Princeton University Library with the provision that they could not be opened up until 50 years after the latter of their two deaths. Eliot died in 1965 and Hale died in 1969. Princeton subsequently announced that the letters would be made available to the public on January 2nd, 2020. I became determined to try and tell Emily Hale's story before then. Some have asked, why didn't I wait until the letters were open? One reason was that along the way, I learned that Eliot had arranged for Hale's letters to be destroyed. So we will never fully know her side of the story. But I was determined to capture their story as best I could. While I had to create some scenes in my novel, I tried to remain faithful to what we did know about their lives. Hale actually had a very interesting life. She taught speech and drama at 4 prominent women's colleges and 2 private schools. She was also a gifted amateur actress who continued to perform up until a year before her death. She was the daughter and niece of Unitarian clergymen. She was very discreet about her relationship with Eliot, and I think her skill as an actress was one reason they were able to keep their relationship secret until after their deaths. I was forced by my personal circumstances to do much of my research from home. This underscored for me how much easier historical research is now than it was when I was in college. I also recognized that I had easy access to more materials than many earlier Eliot biographers did. I could read reviews of Hale's acting performances in searchable online newspapers from all across the country. Yearbooks and alumni publications were also online from many of the places where she had taught. With Google and Wikipedia and online genealogical records, I could track down many details about her famous friends and family members. I was eventually able to visit some of the places where she had lived and worked, but I could also find photographs of others online. The last place Hale taught was Abbott Academy, which is now part of Phillips Andover outside of Boston. This photo is from one of the school's publications at the time she retired. Through its archivist, I got connected to several of its alumni, women who are now close to 80, who were among the last of Emily Hale's students. They invited me to speak about my research at their 60th reunion. Their memories were important to my research because she taught them at what was a key point in her relationship with Eliot. But I ran into some hurdles along the way. Eliot's former publishing company has been publishing his collected letters, but they've only gotten through 1938. If a researcher wants to even read one of his unpublished letters in the collection at Harvard, you have to get permission from the Eliot estate. I also had to secure permissions and pay licensing fees for the Eliot poetry I wanted to quote in my book. And all of that took more time than I had expected. But I was thrilled when my book was in fact published by January 2nd, 2020. After 5 years of work, I decided I had to be at Princeton when the letters were finally opened on January 2nd. Again, because of the stipulations of the Eliot estate, you can only read the letters at Princeton and transcribe them. You can't make copies of them. That may change when the letters are edited and published, possibly sometime next year. The librarians did not know how much of a stampede, as one called it, to expect on opening day. In fact, there were 6 researchers, all of them women, and 2 male reporters who were based in New York but working for English newspapers. It turned out that the story was a bigger deal in England than it was in the United States. Although Eliot was born in St. Louis and educated at Harvard, he became a British citizen in the late 1920s. For Eliot scholars, the letters were worth waiting for. Not only did Eliot pour out his passionate feelings for Hale, he also provided details of what had inspired many of his works. He also revealed his true feelings about many of his contemporaries. The letters also corrected some aspects of the Hale-Eliot relationship that earlier biographers got wrong. After I began reading them, I created a section on my website to correct some of the things that were wrong in my novel. I asked one of the country's leading Eliot scholars to characterize for me what she had discovered when she began reading the letters, and she responded, quote, "For nearly a century, critics have been laboring to unearth the literary, religious, philosophical, and cultural sources of Eliot's words and ideas. Much of this scholarship remains valid, but it seems distinctly less significant in light of what Eliot himself writes about his own poetry in his letters." Later that morning, Harvard University's Houghton Library dropped a bombshell of its own. It released a letter Eliot had written in 1960 with instructions that it be made public when Emily Hale's letters finally were unveiled. Eliot's letter was shockingly nasty in its tone, disavowing that he had ever loved Hale and saying that if he had married her, it would have killed the poet in him. It went on to stipulate that they had never had sexual relations and that he had, in fact, arranged for all of Hale's letters to be destroyed. Eliot's 1960 letter ended with a sort of over-the-moon declaration of his love for his second wife, Valerie Fletcher, his one-time secretary, who was 38 years younger than he was. Eliot's letter was so counter to the words of the letters we were reading that it was hard to understand what had made him write it. We concluded that he had feared his second wife might still be alive when Hale's letters were open, and he wrote it to try to protect her. Valerie Eliot did, in fact, tightly manage her husband's literary estate for many years, but she died in 2012 at the age of 86. Eliot could not have anticipated that his letter from the grave would arrive in the middle of the Me Too movement and actually generated more media coverage for the opening of Hale's letters than if he had chosen to ignore them. Because I focused on researching Hale's history rather than interpreting Eliot's literary works, I've been gratified that Eliot scholars have invited me to write and talk about the details I've learned about Hale's life. One of the scholars it's been my pleasure to get to know is John Whittier Ferguson, a longtime faculty member in the English department at Michigan. John now serves as vice president of the International T.S. Eliot Society and editor of its quarterly newsletter. Several of us who were present for the opening of the letters were asked to contribute essays to the newsletter about our discoveries, and it was fun for me to be edited by an English professor since I'd never had that experience when I was at Michigan. I'm now continuing to study the Eliot-Hale correspondence with an eye to writing a traditional biography of Emily Hale. The final book I want to discuss briefly is my biography, Elly Peterson, Mother of the Moderates, which University of Michigan Press published in 2011. Peterson first came to my attention in 1964 when I was 13 and watching the televised coverage of the Republican National Convention. I think I took note of her because it was so rare to see a woman on the national political stage back then, and I was proud that she came from my home state of Michigan. That year, Peterson became the first woman to address a national political convention in prime time. She was serving in the top job then available to a woman in the Republican Party, and she was running against Phil Hart for the U.S. Senate seat from Michigan. A year later, she became the first woman to chair a state Republican organization when George Romney recruited her for the job in the wake of Barry Goldwater's disastrous defeat. This photo is from 1969 when there were actually two women serving as Republican state party chairs. Gives you a sense of what Elly Peterson was up against when she broke into organizations like this. Peterson returned to my radar screen in the early 1970s when she became active on the Republican side of the National Women's Political Caucus, which, as I noted, was founded during my years in Michigan. I later got to know her personally when she moved to the same retirement community in North Carolina where my parents lived. In 1976, Peterson served in a high-ranking job in Gerald Ford's presidential campaign, but she was also recruited, along with her friend, Democrat Liz Carpenter, to serve as co-chair of ERA America, a coalition of women's groups that were working to try to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This era has been captured in the new miniseries, Mrs. America, which features Cate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly. The series is now streaming on Hulu on FX. Of course, not every feminist could be covered in a 9-hour series. Still, I was disappointed that Peterson and Carpenter were not included as characters. Actually, in 1967, Peterson and her moderate allies had succeeded in blocking Schlafly's election as president of the National Republican Women's Federation. However, it may have been a case of winning the battle but losing the war, because in the wake of her defeat, Schlafly left the Federation, took the mailing lists of her supporters, and started the Phyllis Schlafly Report and later the Eagle Forum, which are covered in the series. The mini-series details how Schlafly eventually positioned herself as the face of opposition to the ERA, and Peterson and Carpenter were specifically recruited to provide a counterweight to Schlafly. At the time, they were viewed as safe, moderate political pros who had a lot of chits they could call in because of their years of work in the political trenches. As an aside, when I traveled to Richmond in 2018 to urge members of the Virginia General Assembly to ratify the ERA, it was sobering to realize that I was now older than Peterson had been when she was described as silver-haired and matronly looking. It was also a stark reminder of how long some of these battles have been going on. Peterson clearly viewed Schlafly as her nemesis and would have agreed with the overall thrust of the miniseries. At a women's conference in Michigan in 1983, scheduled just after the ratification deadline passed, she said of Schlafly, quote, "An opportunist, a born loser until she could identify against her own sex, unable to get elected to Congress, unable to get elected to head the Republican women, unable to get on advisory boards for the conservative presidential candidates, unable to get a good Washington appointment, or any appointment for that matter. Then came ERA. It gave her a chance to shine, and the media helped make her the grande dame of negativism. But an interesting sidelight, her little band of women against women never grows. It's Phyllis who appoints the regional and state leaders. It's Phyllis who does the national press things. It is Phyllis who collects the money, makes no accounting, runs the show." Ironically, Peterson and Schlafly had some things in common. They both were born in the Midwest. They both ran for Congress, although under different circumstances. They were both good public speakers and born political organizers. But one difference was the extent to which they mentored others. Unlike Schlafly, Peterson had no children of her own, but she had a wide circle of proteges who affectionately called her mother, hence the subtitle of my book. Among her proteges was Christine Todd Whitman, who went on to serve as governor of New Jersey and head of the Environmental Protection Agency. I think Peterson would be proud that Whitman is continuing to speak out today for the same progressive principles that Peterson supported. So I hope that I've helped you understand what inspired me to tell these stories. I want to close with a quote from another history major at Michigan. Back in 1994, Jean King said, "Unless we record our history, it will be lost." Jean took pains to preserve her own history. I know many of us who are spending the days of the shutdown going through our own records and those of our families. So before you throw them out, I hope you'll think about where they might be donated. I know that there's so many other unknown women whose stories deserve to be told. Thank you. David, I think you're muted. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
There's a quote that came up in a meeting that I was in on Sunday, not related to the University of Michigan, surprise, surprise, but it's a quote from a man that reminds me, that Jean King's quote reminds me of. Let's see. "The past is never dead. It's not even past." That's Faulkner. And I think your quote from Jean King expresses that. So the work you've done to remind us of things is very important. Are there people who would like to ask questions through the chat feature? If so, oh, good. Dorothy wants to know, did you speak with Ann Crowley regarding sex discrimination in the science department?
Yes, Anne was, I exchanged emails with Anne. She was one of the women I referred to, the superstars who were driven away from Michigan. And Anne was in the astronomy department. Her husband was in the astronomy department, and she kept wanting a regular an appointment. And she was actually a woman who, while the HEW complaint was going on, pursued her own grievance. And I found out about Ann Cowley. I didn't really know about her at the time I was at Michigan, but Harriet Mills, the member of the Women's Commission, was one of the women who left behind an oral history. And she mentioned Professor Cowley's case as one of the egregious examples. It was, Cowley had left Michigan by that time, but she did it in a very, I think to her, satisfying way because she was so angry at them. She did a sabbatical at Arizona State. In the meantime, she was part of a 3-person team who discovered, I think it was like the second black hole. It was a major astronomical discovery. And so at the point she had this major scientific breakthrough, at that point, the department was ready to give her a job. And what she did is, I think she stayed at Arizona State for another year, kind of keeping them dangling. And they finally said, look, you got to tell us whether you're coming back. And she said, no, I'm going to stay at Arizona State, and served out the rest of her career there, and, you know, became a major figure in astronomical organizations and all. And she actually told me, I guess I never talked to her. We swapped emails. And of course, like a lot of the women of this age, you know, they're dealing with health issues, and some of them sadly are no longer could have an interview. But she clearly was still very angry over her treatment. She did mention also that she had experienced a case of being in an elevator at a professional conference when one of the leading leaders of whatever was the astronomy community's professional organization at the time, came onto her in the elevator. And, you really felt very vulnerable. These were people who controlled your future. And so something she never talked about. And so, there was obviously a lot of sexual harassment going on at the time, even before people really had a name for it.
In fact, Catherine McKinnon, who's a professor at Michigan, coined the term. In the post-Neil Gorsuch decision press, Linda Greenhouse had a wonderful column, and I think obviously the Times, and she made the point how Neil Gorsuch didn't do anything illogical. Justice Alito was criticizing things that were already held to be sex discrimination, including harassment. And the term harassment was coined by Catherine McKinnon several years after Title VII. The question that was just asked, though, reminded me of why Larry Summers lost his job as president of Harvard, with his view that women are not qualified to be good in the STEM fields. In your research about Michigan back in the day, and even since, have female academics, have women done better in the non-STEM fields than in the STEM fields, or was it pretty bad across the board? And does it continue to be bad across the board?
I think there were lots of examples. One of the things, and I also expressed that when I worked on my book, I focused on certain departments where I knew of a case like Cowley's. One of the things, I got to say, frankly, shocked me, because I know he's remembered and well respected as a history professor. Sidney Fine was chairman of the history department around this time. And another case involved a woman, Helen Tanner, who was trying to get a permanent appointment in history and ended up leaving the university and, doing a lot in terms of Native American history and, writing a classic guide to Great Lakes Indians. But Fine, in sort of arguing why they wouldn't give her a job, said, well, we have this policy for the past 20 years. We haven't hired a single one of our doctorate students as a professor, which was kind of ironic because he was hired as a history doctorate student like 22 years, so it was like he was ignoring the fact that he had actually gotten his job through that mechanism. And, so, and there were lots of cases, as Esther Lardon's quote reflected, of women and men who worked in the same department, which, you're likely going to meet. It was not unusual for faculty members of graduate school age to meet and both be seeking jobs. And I think it's probably a challenge for universities now in terms of accommodating spouses and their career needs. But where the man would get the regular appointment and then the woman would have to kind of cobble together research grants and, rarely be given tenure. And, this was one of the things that when HEW came in and started, pulling files and comparing, the qualifications. In some cases, the women were actually better qualified than their husbands were.
One questioner wants to know what the role of Esther Lardon was. This is someone who went to law school with Esther Lardon at the University of Chicago.
Yeah, she, one of her early jobs, she was attracted to the civil rights movement, and she had wanted actually, I think, to go down to Mississippi and, work with like Southern Poverty Law Center. Her husband was a med school student and he wanted to go to a good med school, and he got into, I think, University of Chicago, and he didn't want to go to Mississippi because, he didn't think much of their medical schools. So she moved to Chicago, and she got this job in the regional office of civil rights at HEW. And so when they sent this investigative team, a 4-person team, I think, and that the only person who was kind of in the news or quoted was the man who was the team leader in the first case. It was Clifford Minton, and in the second team, it was a man named Don Scott, who became the person that Fleming was then dealing with. But the other team members, and it's interesting because Jean King kind of referred, that they were 2 young women, and as Jean put it, Jean could have a blunt way that they didn't say anything, but the way they shook their fannies on the sofa kind of thing led her to know that they were sympathetic to, what she was saying and all. And indeed, they did, they were asking tough questions and looking for things. And Lardon continued to have some interaction with women at Michigan and challenging some of the administrators. But I think at one point, I don't know if it was when her husband finally graduated, I think she got, she described it later on in this oral history she did. She got feeling burnt out because, of course, as the Nixon administration went on, there was a tension as to whether they were really going to enforce these rules. And I think she felt frustrated that you had this great weapon of withholding the contracts, but nobody was willing to use it. If they went and complained to higher ups at HEW, they would back off from it. And so I think she ended up, back in the Washington area, and I don't know her precise career path other than, she ended up teaching law at Georgetown and their law institute and becoming a big figure in pro bono law.
Someone
sadly is now deceased, so I was grateful to have the oral history since I could not, interview her myself.
Someone asked the question, why do you think it took so long for the Title IX regs to be finalized? And then he wrote, and if you don't, he does. He was a lawyer at HEW at the time. So let's see how you do on the quiz. Why did it take so long?
Well, I think a couple things. One, they were skillful in how they got it through Congress. And Edith Green, who was chair of the Education Subcommittee at the time, she in fact told women, don't come on and lobby for this. We're going to kind of keep it under the radar screen. And I know that it was, when they initially, they held hearings on amendments to the Education Act in 1970, which Bunny Sandler used as a mechanism for really documenting the extent of sex discrimination at universities so that people would believe it was a real problem. At that point, most of the concern was on the potential impact on single-sex universities and whether they would be forced to go co-ed. So I think when Title IX came along, you know, they were really more focused on that problem rather than the potential impact on athletics. In terms of why it took along, I mean, I think part of it is simply any federal regulation, you have an effective date, and then it takes agencies sometimes years to get the regs in place. That was one of the things that was very frustrating to you know, Sandler and King and the university administrators to a certain extent, because these laws would pass and they'd start enforcing them, but they hadn't fully written the regulations so that people would know what they were expected to do. And but I'm happy to have to unmute the person who's on the call if he wants to elaborate or doesn't feel I answered the question correctly.
Yeah, I'd love to hear the rest of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. This is Stephen Spitz. How you doing? Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Stephen Spitz. I was at HEW, and what happened, I was there from 73 until 78. What happened is the final regs were all ready to go, but the secretary of HEW at the time, Dave Matthews, refused to sign off on them. There was great hope when Joe Califano arrived in the Carter administration in 77, and Joe Califano sat on him. He put all sorts of hoops through. There were demonstrations by various women's groups until he finally, I think it took a couple years into his tenure before he finally gave in and approved the regulations. So it was slow walked by both the Republicans and the Democrats in HEW.
Steve, did it have to wait for Shirley to become Secretary of Ed for it to happen, or did Califano?
No, I think it happened eventually under Califano. He also slow walked the Section 504 disability regulations. He basically didn't do very much on civil rights. He was focused on healthcare, and he just basically, you know, there were demonstrations of people in wheelchairs at his house, and there was a lot of pressure put on. There was a lot of hope that he would act. You know, finally the Carter administration was going to enforce these new laws, but he didn't until you know, pressured. No, that happened before Title IX regs came out. If I'm not mistaken, in 78, I think.
So it didn't have to wait for a woman cabinet secretary after all. Okay.
No, but it had to wait for a lot of women to put pressure on the men.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the, you know, and I was focusing on this story. I admittedly focused on the first part of the 70s. It's an ongoing story without an end, and so you sort of have to, you know, decide where's the end point. I'm going to write about, and I have kind of a final chapter, you know, in the end where, you know, I acknowledge things that have changed and things that haven't changed, and you know, it's a continuing battle and lots of you know, political considerations, as my friend Steve Spitz knows, because we worked on political things together. Another question.
Let's see. There's a few things we should cover before the evening ends. I don't want to foreclose questions on these important issues that's going to be in your new book that's coming out any day now. But how far into the future will be your novel, the novelization of your biography that you're working on, the fiction version of The Poet's Girl, so to speak?
No, the fiction version is written.
Ooh, great.
The biography is what I would work on next.
Right. The biography, how far away are we from that?
Always, you know, it's not just the writing, it's then you have to find somebody willing to, you know, publish it and all the other things you have to do. One of the things that you also wrestle with in these kinds of situations is citations. And, you know, my Elly Peterson book is footnoted. You know, there's some thought that sometimes footnotes can get in the way of narration. So in Conquering Heroines, I worked out an agreement where in the back, I have the citations broadly of my sources and also more specific references. In The Poet's Girl, I actually have I was really concerned about maintaining my credibility with the Eliot scholarly community. So I included a much longer section on my sources, in part to demonstrate that I was serious about this and not just making it all up out of whole cloth. So, because there's been so much written about Eliot, it's, you know, it's hard to, you know, you wanted to try to get it right, even though the letters actually showed a new side of Eliot that surprised a lot of the Eliot scholars.
Before the evening ends, I'd like you, if you want to talk about where you think the Elly Petersons of America are, male and female, in the 21st century. But before that, I'd like you to talk about what it's like to be, I think of you, really, to the Michigan Daily, as a John Dickerson's mom, Nancy, you know, as a pioneer in broadcast television, that sort of thing. And she's just the one that comes to mind, but there's several others. I mean, I could mention Pauline Fredericks from an earlier era. Maybe if you could spend a few minutes talking about being a pioneer in a horribly all-male world for so many years. But before we flip to that, does anyone else want to talk about the Title IX issues and discrimination in academia? I don't want to foreclose that. If anyone has questions, please ask. I see something in the chat line. No, was someone thanking you for your presentation? Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Sam, for that. Do you want to tackle the male and female Elly Petersons of America today, or do you want to talk about being a pioneer woman in journalism along with?
Well, just to comment on the male and female Eliot Petersons. You know, I interviewed Elly Peterson in around 2006, I think, and she was already very distressed about the rightward turn of the Republican Party. She considered herself an independent by that point. And, you know, when it came time to, you know, publish and market my book, you know, the people who remembered Elly Peterson or had been involved with the Republican Party, particularly in Michigan when it was a more moderate force, you know, were very supportive and would come out, you know, to my talks and things, but you could not get, you know, any kind of support in terms of marketing from, you know, current Republican organizations, because she was not someone that, you know, they were looking to as somebody they respected. And I think these things, you know, go in cycles. And I think right now we're seeing a time where people like Governor Whitman and, you know, Mitt Romney and, you know, I mean, some people are, you know, finding their voices, but I think it's very difficult. And, you know, so I do hope they're out there, because I think you need people in the middle, and, you know, they're part of change. When I was working on the Conquering Heroines book, Sue Rasmussen, who'd been affirmative action director at Michigan, she made a quote about the value of the three-legged stool, that when you have, you know, protesters and people who are sort of on the outlier, that it makes, you need also the people in the middle, because when you got in this case, university officials who were opposed to change, it made the middle seem much more acceptable as an alternative to what the extreme was. And so she said the three forces are important to affecting change. And I think that's true. And then just a brief comment on your other question about being a female pioneer. I felt, and particularly as I moved to the Post, that again, when I got out of Michigan, it was really, I had a sense I could do anything, like I said, it was very empowering. It wasn't to say you didn't bump up against instances of, discrimination or disappointment as you move through your career. But I think that the women who were like 5 years older than me had a much tougher time, and including breaking in at places like the Post and in academia and all. And we didn't. I sort of felt sad in a way, because I realized, if you got close to a woman professor, like I was with Kitty Sklar, you didn't always know everything that they were going through, because, they were professionals. They weren't going to talk about it. And I had that conversation, concerning a graduate student of Margaret Davis, who was another professor in the sciences, who also left Michigan in frustration, and her grad student now sort of realizing and focusing on what her professor was going through at the time was just sort of amazed at how well she, held up her head and got through it all.